Good evening, I'm Kim Baird. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional territory of the Tsawwassen and Innovate First Nations. Thanks to the Walrus Foundation for inviting me to speak tonight on the topic of innovation. And the definition I found for innovation is the act or process of introducing new ideas, devices, or methods. And generally, I think society often innovates in response to a problem we need or to solve a challenge that confronts us. The title of my presentation is Reconciliation, the Need to Innovate Canada's Identity, because I think we've been long at a crossroads when it comes to Indigenous communities and Canada. I have a very short time to cover what I view as the challenge of our time, so apologies if my presentation seems to oversimplify things. First, I'll share a bit of my background, which has formed my views about this topic. I was a leader in my community for 22 years, 13 of which I was the chief, and all of which I spent advancing a modern treaty for my community, the Tuason First Nation. I successfully concluded the negotiations, but am most proud of the fact that 96% of my community participated in voting on it, and about 70% of them who voted approved the agreement. This high level of engagement was not accidental and took a lot of work from me and my team. After the vote, I was privileged to lead the charge for our reassertion of self-governance. And on April 3rd in 2009, we removed the Indian Act from our community and replaced it with our own laws. While negotiations took 12 years, the community building, or what I view as our internal reconciliation, was taking place my whole 22 years at Tuason. And it's still taking place as we figure out how we want to move forward as a community without the Indian Act and to improve socioeconomic conditions for our people and ensure we are sustainable people on the territory we have inhabited for thousands of years. How do we overcome the terrible impacts of colonization? I can help create new governance institutions based on our community's design and have helped set a path for sustainability with a huge focus on investing in our community needs. Many view this as an innovation. Our first project is controversial, a mega mall that just opened a couple weeks ago. The mall will be a huge economic generator, not only for my community, but for the region. Over 284,000 people visited during the first 6 days, so many people had problems getting out of the parking lot. We've gone from being completely dependent on federal funding to being a major contributor to the economy regionally and beyond. This is just one example of change we're going through, and the changes we face are disruptive and deep and controversial. Our experience is but one model of reconciliation, but having come from the trenches, it has provided me with some unique insight on this topic. When talking about reconciliation, we can't forget the foundation of Canada, and this is our uncomfortable truth as a country. Indigenous peoples occupied the Americas for tens of thousands of years. When European settlers came over, it was at the expense of Indigenous populations, and this came in many forms, from the decimation of populations from old world diseases, to the occupation of lands and the use of legislation to usurp Indigenous rights and title, to aggressive attempts to subjugation through residential schools. The foundations of non-Indigenous Canada ain't pretty, let's say. That isn't to say that every person had malicious intents. It's far more complex than that. But the systemic discrimination of Indigenous communities is so firmly entrenched that many of us don't even recognize our own often negative biases about Indigenous people. And these legacies have left us with terrible consequences, primarily poverty for First Nations, but also our sustainability as communities with legal, political, and economic rights having been undermined and replaced with the Indian Act, a woefully inadequate legal framework that is nearly impossible to make work for our communities. And then to add insult to injury, our people get blamed for not being able to make it work. There have been many attempts to grapple with what seems like an intractable issue, from attempts with former prime ministers like the Kelowna Accord and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and now we see Prime Minister Trudeau's commitments to various initiatives, including the adoption of the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous Peoples, and a commitment to restore a nation-to-nation relationship. It's still early days for these initiatives, and the dialogue is just starting, but expectations and impatience are at very high levels. And make no mistake, the courts have helped move this issue along, whether it be the Supreme Court decisions on how government has its honor at stake to ensure it deals with consulting and accommodating First Nation rights and title, to the William decision where the Chilcotin have established Aboriginal title. Our day of reckoning on resolving these issues arrived long ago. The time to innovate is overdue. And we must respect the self-determination of each First Nation and Indigenous community and recognize that there are many internal issues that need to be sorted due to colonization and very real capacity challenges. Reconciliation must be at all levels for Indigenous communities, including legal, political, economic, jurisdictional, ownership, and extraction rights. First Nations must have a quality of life comparable to other Canadians. It's not just rectifying the horror of residential schools, and the TRC is a great start in my opinion, but it doesn't deal with the full gamut of issues our communities need to resolve. Reconciliation must also provide for self-determination and respect different ways for Indigenous groups in Canada to engage. Modern treaties provide for First Nations to be citizens of Canada, while some Indigenous groups will never identify as Canadians. We must have a way of moving forward in spite of these important differences. No cookie-cutter approach will work for everyone, but we do have some models to look to, and we should study these here and internationally. I sense and welcome the public's growing discomfort over what we see in First Nation communities today. We need to do better. We need to envision a Canada where these gross inequities do not persist, where First Nations and Canadians can benefit from a sustainable future, embracing our differences instead of letting them drive what I currently view to be unacceptable outcomes. We will need to innovate to get there. We will need to engage with each other through our political leaders and through grassroots discussions. As Maury Sinclair has said, there are no shortcuts to reconciliation. This will be hard work for all of us, but work we must let our respective leaders know as important. In my vision, we will innovate Canada's institutions in the process of reconciliation by indigenizing Canadian government systems and structures. This means Indigenous participation won't come as an afterthought, but will be enabled from the structures and processes of our institutions to the continued representation of First Nation issues in Parliament and Senate. This enablement of First Nation involvement must be in partnership with First Nations. There must be also be co-created paths for First Nations that do not want to participate within Canadian structures. The Tuason Treaty is a controversial model, and our decisions have been controversial as well. My purpose here isn't to advance Tuason's approach, but it was the right approach in my community. It was our innovation and our path to reconciliation with British Columbia and Canada. I'm here to say reconciliation is possible, but it needs to respect self-determination of First Nations, and we will all have to compromise to make it work. It will only be through innovation that we resolve these long outstanding issues. We need to innovate our vision of what a reconciled Canada is, and it will only be through innovation that together we set our path forward, making Canada a place all of its residents can be proud of. Thank you.